Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick, and we're here for the next of our season reviews. Tonight is the wide receivers, and joining me for that is Jake Vogel. Jake, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, Ken. How about you?
Can't complain. I'm still trying to get over the AFC Championship loss. I think we need to acknowledge here at the top, we're recording this on Thursday evening at 9 p.m. And about 5 hours ago, it was reported by various sources that there have been allegations made about Zay Flowers. It's my position on this, and I think we, based on our pre-show discussion here, we share this opinion. We're going to let this play out on its own. We have nothing to add, certainly, in terms of independent information here. And I'm just simply going to wait for the facts and the investigation to roll out. I don't have anything to say about it. Jake, anything else you'd like to say up front?
I agree about that. I don't really care to talk about it, and we're really trying to talk about what happened during the 2023 season with the Ravens.
All right. Well, great. Let's get right to that. Monken, of course, brought in at the beginning of the year, certainly brought a more spread passing game, much more 11 personnel, and much less of the truly heavy sets the Ravens ran last year. They ran a lot of 22, even 21, 13, 12. They ran a little bit less of pretty much everything except maybe 12. And the overall offense went from, the heaviest in history in a relative sense to a much lighter offense. Still not a super light offense because they did make use of Patrick Ricard even in the Monken offense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I thought that was one of the points this year kind of in training camp that a lot of fans were talking about. It almost seemed like, some of it was based on Todd Monken's words in the past. And he's pretty good in the media, and he's very straightforward in what he says. But it felt like Patrick Ricard might not be in a super important piece in this offense, just based on what some people were saying. I never truly felt that way. I love Pat Ricard. I think he does a lot of good things in the passing offense as, basically an extra offensive lineman, an inline tight end. Somebody that can help chip block and stuff like that as well. And then what he does in the run game is phenomenal. So it was good to see him have such good success in the Monken offense, considering Georgia, where Todd was previously, does not really use much in the way of fullbacks. But Ricard nowadays is more of a tight end. We'll get on to wide receiver.
Yeah, we certainly will. And I wanted to ask you about Georgia, though, too, because Georgia, of course, last year had the current Steelers tight end Washington playing a lot in line.
Right.
And I thought of him as being very similar, but you mentioned not a fullback, and I think you're 100% right about that, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, let's move on a little bit. Lamar, a big game from the pocket this year, and really tried a little more of that. Tried a little more to not roll early in plays. Rolling early, of course, cuts down on the field you have available, so it does tend to take your wide receivers more out of the game. It makes you more into your options are more like a boot. Now, Lamar Jackson mitigates some of that because of all NFL quarterbacks, he's willing to throw back to the middle of the field like nobody. And if you can find him space, he'll try and find you, even if it's a slightly disadvantaged throw. But I thought keeping in the pocket is certainly going to allow him to use more of the field. One of the things we'd heard coming into this year, we talked about Lamar always really staying in the middle of the field with a football, rarely going outside the numbers. And then this year, great year outside the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think before the season, you expected a lot more in the screen game, and we saw some of that for sure. But also what Lamar was doing in the intermediate and deeper part of the field on along the sideline with his throws from the pocket were pretty impressive. So I think he's made some pretty big strides in that area.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We saw in particular in the last few weeks of the year, a lot of receivers get lost in coverage outside the numbers. That was really nice. In terms of the receivers, Certainly had some solid individual play. We're going to talk about each one separately, how they fit into the offense, where they could fit for next year and whatnot. The one question that I have to ask, and I think, there were definitely some pluses from it, but did the loss of Mark Andrews when he was hurt, and then there was about a 6 or 7 week period where he wasn't on the field, did that really help the Ravens in terms of identifying some additional receivers who could really help them? They certainly weren't hurt in terms of the games they won during that period.
Right. I definitely think there was silver lining in him, missing time. You got to see much more potential out of Isaiah Likely for sure. And I think when Lamar doesn't have his clear-cut number one security blanket, he maybe doesn't have too much of a tendency that defenses can focus in on. So that was definitely a plus to it. But I think the offense was starting to kind of get its legs under itself, right before Mark Andrews got hurt. And then I think it took them a week or 2 weeks or a little bit longer for them to kind of figure out who they were without Andrews. And then they started really looking good at the end of the regular season. And then they brought him back into the fold. And it's kind of hard to say whether that was a negative impact on the team in the playoffs. I don't really think that's a reason to say Andrew shouldn't have been out there. I disagree with that, but
he only played 18 snaps, so it really be a hard case to make if you want. I mean, Likely was the number one receiver for that game, a number one tight end. Flowers' play during the year certainly changed greatly from being more of a gadget guy early in the year, a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of wide receiver screens, to being more of a deep target as the year went on. In a lot of the early season, they relied on Odell Beckham for some of the deep targets, a few others too, but Beckham honestly was a primary one. And as the season moved on, Flowers became a target, and players like Mitchell and Hill became more of the gadget guys to use their speed effectively in space underneath.
Yeah, I would agree with that big time. What was really frustrating, I'm sure for you as it was for me, was the usage of Flowers for probably about half of the season. I just felt like he was not getting enough targets in the intermediate portions of the field. He was getting, everything short, screens, little end around swing passes and this and that. And it was just not giving him enough availability and options in space. I mean, I understand the screen game is to get the ball to a playmaker and let him do what he does, but we'll get to it about each player. But the yards per target and yards per reception are just not what they should have been for a player of his talent.
Yeah, a lot of that basically is that you have value you get from Flowers in a couple different ways. And the first, of course, is to get the ball in the hands of a playmaker, try and make a play in space. And you don't want to ever say you're never going to throw him a wide receiver screen, because then the other team doesn't have to be cognizant of that as a risk. And you can't slow down their blitzes easily, for example, if you just say and you go through with never doing that. But the other part of it is Flowers is supposed to attract multiple defenders. And the way to attract a second defender is to basically threaten to get past that cornerback. And to do that, he's got to run more of the vertical route tree, more sevens, more nines, and actually force that safety out of his very comfortable position in the middle of the field, where he still has options on who to make. So anyway, they really needed to get more out of Flowers, and most of the time you're facing a zone defense when you have Lamar Jackson at quarterback. Mm-hmm. So it's an opportunity also to get eyes off Lamar. To have that safety taken out of the play, which is nice. So that was unfortunate. I do think that usage at least evolved over the course of the season is something that's much more valuable by the end.
Yeah, I completely agree about
that. This is a very, very expensive group to assemble. I think that's one of the things that we're going to look at during this year in terms of draft capital. They used the 1 on Zay Flowers. They used a 6 on Nelson Aguilar because of the compensatory pick that they gave away. They spent $3.25 million, including the void year money, which does count, by the way. You have to count all that money on Nelson Aguilar. They spent whatever it was, 15 to 18 million on Beckham, and I don't know exactly what he cashed in on in terms of incentives, but there was some that he got, some that he didn't.
Yeah.
And they're going to pay for that in 2024 and beyond, potentially, depending on how they allow those dollars to flow out. But it's not a cheap guy to bring in. And then, of course, you're sitting on Bateman, who's the number one pick, and he got a lot less attention in this offense. Did not have a good year, by the way. I can't paint that. We're gonna talk about Bateman a little bit, but just the expense of putting together this wide receiver room. It was a shift in style from the Roman years, and it was a expensive one.
I completely agree about that. We'll get into whether the return on investment was worth it, but I definitely felt like the team benefited from the receiving talent that they had this season, even though I don't think a ton of that showed up on paper in the statistics of the passing offense. I do think that it helped Lamar. I think it helped this offense, and Lamar is a great player. Like, he did what he did in 2019 with much less receiving talent. So who knows what it would have been, but it looks like tonight he's probably going to win another MVP. And I think part of that is the group around him.
Yeah, it was certainly was a much more talented group, and hitting on their first round pick at wide receiver in terms of production in his rookie year, expected development, and whatnot, and Flowers is obviously a big part of that. And so let's jump into the individual things. We'll start with Flowers. Obviously, couldn't be a more critical and direct addition to a problem than him at 22. Being a guy who, a lot of other teams had coveted, but there are also some questions about size that I think other teams couldn't get by that made him still available at that point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he was the third receiver taken, and there were 4 first rounders. So he was definitely in the mix, but I guess, at least 2 teams said, hey, we like him, but not quite as much as this other guy. So I think the Ravens benefited from that. Zay Flowers was probably the best rookie wide receiver taken in the first round. Of course, Puka Nacua, gosh, what he did as a 5th rounder is just amazing. And Matthew Stafford kind of has that ability to really create productive wide receivers. I'm not trying to take away talent from those guys, but you can look at the history.
There are four taken in a row there, were Jackson Smith and Jigba by Seattle, then Quentin Johnson by the Chargers, Zay Flowers by Baltimore, and Jordan Addison by the Vikings. And Addison actually had the most yardage and 10 touchdowns. So I'm sure the Vikings are claiming, well, we got the deal here, and they might be right. But in terms of Flowers, working inside of a team that consistently had the lead throughout the season and wasn't, needing to throw the ball to catch up a lot. It certainly looks like his numbers, from my perspective, are very comparable, if not maybe slightly better. Now, there's a big difference in touchdowns there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, anytime that you get double-digit touchdowns versus half of that, that's a significant difference. But so to get into those numbers a little bit, if you want, he had 108 targets on the season with 77 receptions. Now, out of the 4 guys that I really care the most about talking about in the wide receiver room, he did have one of the better catch rates, even though he had some bad drops during the season, especially that Pittsburgh game where hardly any receiver could catch the ball. 71.3% catch rate. 858 receiving yards, which was not great for yards per reception or yards per target. I think he can do a lot better than that in his career. So he had 11.14 yards per reception. And the more important stat that you like to talk about a lot as well is yards per target. And he had 7.94. You wanted to round that up to 8, you could. And then
I could by not following normal rules of rounding. Yes.
Yeah. And then 5 receiving touchdowns. He also did have 1 rushing touchdown that we all remember. So eight carries for the regular season, 7 yards per attempt on those, 56 rushing yards in that touchdown. The 5 receiving touchdowns that he had led the wide receivers. He had the largest touchdown share, which is, the number that I take from Lamar Jackson's total passing touchdowns and just their percentage of that. Especially it would have to come from him. So he didn't have any from
5 out of 24 regular season or something.
Yes.
Okay.
5 out of the 24. And then his touchdown rate, which is also, an interesting stat to look at, was 4.6%. So that is, he would score a touchdown 4.6% of the time based on his targets.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So one of the interesting numbers, I like to look at this because it'll often tell you where something is not right. But a receiver of Flowers' size can often be in a position where he costs you some interceptions because he can't fight them as well as a bigger receiver can. 110.2 rating throwing to him on the year. So that's a good one. And, obviously, I think part of what you're seeing in terms of the catch rate is propped up by a lot of the passes behind the line of scrimmage, which are very high probability. If you look at running back catch rates, they're very high. If you look at inside linebacker catch rates allowed, they're incredibly high. So you really give up a lot of short throws there. Connected to Lamar, obviously, by where they come from, by the fact they got together before the season, the fact that Beckham and Flowers got together, I thought was absolutely terrific. It had to help Flowers in ways that were not simply connection with Lamar, but were also, maybe some route running tips from Odell Beckham and whatnot. Some players really want that mentoring component, and I never got really a strong sense either direction from Beckham. I think he probably would give it if asked. Justin Houston seems to be a natural teacher. You've seen him. Here's how I work on my muscle memory, and he's going at a tackling dummy or whatever to show that. But I thought their time away really benefited him, and I hope Bateman gets some of that time this offseason because I think it's critical to his development.
I agree completely. He has had some of that time in his career, but it just hasn't felt like he's really bonded too much over the offseason with Lamar. And a lot of that is probably due to injury. Mm-hmm. He's just been banged up, multiple off seasons. So that's always going to hurt your chemistry and your ability to work with the quarterback when you have free time. So, but yeah, I definitely agree that it would be beneficial, and we're not going to get into the weeds of how important he'll be next year, but definitely.
Yeah. We talked about him being used as a gadget player early in the season. Usage evolved into definitely a lot of higher ADOT work later in the year. So average throws further down the field. Next gen, by the way, tells some different stories about things like separation and whatnot for receivers. And I took the next gen stuff since that's calibrated on the field, and I don't have the raw data that PFF uses, which looks like it might be different. It should come from next gen. I would think it would. It would come from the same source in terms of measuring separation, because I don't think there would be an easy way to do it otherwise. I don't. Right. And so it should be the same source of information. But they showed Bateman with really outstanding separation. Bateman actually comes in pretty low on the separation scores, on separation by yards that are here. I'm a little hesitant to buy into separation numbers as they show up here. And the reason is that when you have throws that are behind the line of scrimmage, you may get a separation number that is not really an apples to apples comparison. Sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's other variables as well. If the team keys in on Bateman not being a real threat on a given play. I mean, there might be separation that way that the Ravens didn't capitalize on. There's tons of potential reasons for him having such a high score based on those sources. So, he is a good route runner. I will give him that, though.
I think he's a very sudden athlete. I think there's actually quite a bit left there as a route runner. And this is something, by the way, it's on the table. This is a good thing. If you can have the kind of season he had and there's still room for improvement, that's all the better. And what I think he doesn't really do is wiggle at the top of the route to throw the defensive back off. I think he just he puts his foot in the dirt and he's too quick for them. And that's terrific. And in zone, he has ability to come back to that spot in space where it's going to be open. That's all great. But I would not actually credit his route running with the thing. I'd credit a general suddenness to his play. I did want to talk about a separation for a second. 3.7 yards is 13th best in the tight end and wide receiver group. It's actually 7th best among wide receivers only. Surprisingly, the separation group is dominated by tight ends. And so there's something going on there, and I don't know exactly what it is, but there's some element of patterns or play action or whatever that is creating, a large set of high separation targets for tight ends. And I think if you think about just watching football, it's much more common to see the tight end running wide open down the seam than it is a wide receiver. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a difference between their separation stat in zone versus man coverage, but if you're talking about zone, then I mean, if all of it's on the board and they're just collecting data in that way, then you're going to have more separation from tight ends, finding space where the linebackers aren't and the safety's not there, and a wide receiver might be carrying somebody deep, and there's a lot of ways that.
Completely agree. I mean, it makes all kinds of sense that it would be tied to either one of those two, zone man concepts or just elements of play action showing up. Because I've not known people to talk about play action working with wide receivers in general. Sometimes you might talk about a boot, at play action, creating an opportunity on 3 levels, and you're hoping to get that man deep opportunity. Right. I don't know that I've really heard that talked about in terms of separation, but it can be. I know, Torrey Smith was really well known for drawing those PI flags when he was threatening separation at all. So there's that, but. This was interesting, I found. Largest cushion of any NFL wide receiver at the line of scrimmage, 7.7 yards. It's probably in part at least a measure of the amount of zone the Ravens face. Mm-hmm. So there's a desire for some of those cornerbacks probably to drop into some cover 3 looks and be further off the line of scrimmage at the start. Somebody else is going to drift over underneath of Flowers on a lot of those plays. So I'm looking at it. I mean, I don't look at it simply as a measure of how much they're respecting his speed, but there's probably some of that, at least in terms of a relative sense, that might be.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, definitely something that can very much be affected by the zone that they're seeing on a regular basis versus other teams that don't have a quarterback like Lamar Jackson, which is like every team. So
I thought his yak number was a little low for who he is at 5.1 yak per reception. It's middle of the pack for wide receivers and tight ends. Let's put the combination together. And I would expect him to get more than that for 2 reasons. One is he is who he is in terms of speed. So you expect him to have some home run balls in there that are going to lead to touchdowns. The second one is that when he catches a ball behind the line of scrimmage, he's got some red yards, which are kind of like, I won't call them free yak, but they're much easier yak than other things. It's kind of like what Jacoby Jones did on kickoff return rate. So in terms of, if you bring it out from 8 deep, it's pretty easy to average a 24-yard return there.
I agree. I felt like, especially from what we have seen of Bateman when he's been healthy in previous years, you saw a player that probably had the most yards after catch ability in the wide receiver room in Baltimore. That is before Zay Flowers joined, before Aguilar and OBJ. Just a different receiving room, but injuries can derail that. The kind of routes he's running, like if you're running more curls and comebacks, your yards after the catch would greatly hinge upon the separation you have when you actually catch the ball, and then what move you can make to shake the defender coming downhill at you, assuming that they're behind in that kind of situation. So I felt like more of his targets this year were when somebody was kind of closely defending him, even though his separation grades were so high. I felt like a lot of that is kind of empty calories. Like he was separating great, but it was on a pass play that went to someone else, or
That's interesting, and that I don't know whether that separation number only includes his targets or at the time of any throw, how much he'd separated by. But that could explain differences for a player like Bateman.
Sure.
So that's interesting. I'd try and look into that and see what I can find. We talked about his suddenness as an athlete. Don't we need to go any further into that? I don't think. If I had one thing for Zay Flowers to work on for next year, and obviously maintaining that relationship with Lamar is important, but kind of had a lack of situational awareness show up in 3 different plays on this season at least, and something I really hope is a point of emphasis for a team that's very close. And I mean, close to a ring, not close together necessarily, although I'm sure there's some of that. Really just needs to be more situationally aware. And the run for the touchdown against the Chargers, it was a touchdown, great, but he's got to know to go down there. And honestly, that's a place where even though the call should have gone in from Monken to the huddle to say we have a no mas situation here, or whatever code word you have for it, Flowers needs to know himself. He needs to understand himself. Basically, hey, this is going to run at the 2-minute warning. After this, it's 3 kneels and we're done. That's the quickest path to victory, other than give the ball back to the Chargers.
Right. I agree with that. I was on the same page as you during that game, even though a lot of people thought it was, just more fun for him to score a touchdown. I mean, the reality is you're still giving the other team an opportunity to score, to onside kick, to come back in the game, whereas you could quite literally end the game with safe snapping of the ball and kneeling at that point. But
which by the way, I've heard all kinds of frankly idiotic, flatback on that, which is basically that, well, no, there's something could go wrong with a snap or whatever. I mean, it has literally never happened on a play where a kneel was attempted. Okay, there have been plays where the quarterback's trying to recenter the ball. Famous one from the Chargers a few years ago where they blew one.
Right.
Trying to recenter the ball for a field goal. Not the same thing. Okay, yep. You're taking a chance. You're pulling out. You're trying to move left. You don't want to get penetrated on. All that stuff. When the ball is just being snapped into the hands of quarterback for a kneel, it basically never has failed. And also, it's considered incredibly poor football etiquette to try and stop that from occurring. So in a game like that, where Flowers had just stopped short of the 1 yard line, the LA coaches were highly incented not to pull crap and tell their players, dive into the pile, do whatever you have to disrupt the snap. We need the ball back. We need the ball back. They're highly incented not to do that because that could follow them the rest of their career.
Right.
And it's people who think that could have gone wrong. They just don't understand football. They just do not get it. Exactly what the deal is in that situation.
Yeah.
Fumble in the AFC Championship game. I don't think we have to talk about it too much other than he had the first down at the 1 yard line. That was 95% of what they really needed there.
Yeah.
90%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the taunting penalty, of course, we could have done without.
I agree with that. Yeah. Tough go of it. He was a really great player during that game. Kind of like Hollywood Brown in the past.
Yep.
Really showed up in big moments, playoff games, just, over 100 yards receiving. Almost scored there to put the Ravens within reach. And, just like that, a fumble. it's not Lamar's fault. It falls on Zay Flowers. He did have two hands on the ball, but he could have easily protected that ball better. Probably gotten tackled, been at the one, and the Ravens should have been able to punch it in there. So
yeah, you'd have to believe that would probably be been a deal they'd have rather than almost any chance of fumbling that football there.
Right.
Let's move on and talk about Odell Beckham because we're kind of a little bit short on time here. An offseason signing that, I don't think there's anybody who would really claim when it happened that it was the right price for Odell Beckham at his age after missing a full year. I really hadn't heard anybody who's directly said that, but they always try and mitigate it with the soft value of he's a leader, he's a this, he's a that. And it made the Lamar Jackson signing easier. I mean, if you want to make yourself feel better, Lamar Jackson was worth $80 million this year, not 60, not 52.
Right.
So from that perspective, sure. If any additional player needed, you could have given up Mark Andrews, and if you got Lamar Jackson, it'd have been worth it for that price. But you didn't have to. It's two separate transactions. Don't tell me one transaction or both transactions are good because the net effect was good.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. The bang for the buck wasn't quite there with Odell. He did have some good numbers, definitely exceeded my expectations in some of those metrics. But the lack of usage in a way or effectiveness in the playoffs was the thing that really kind of surprised me. I thought that the Ravens were trying to ramp up Odell for the playoffs, and it just seemed like that fell flat, especially in the championship game. But
4.9 yards per target in the two playoff games, obviously not what they had hoped for. Let's talk in terms of expectations are a fleeting thing because people have a way of forgetting where they had pegged people for. Mm-hmm. But talking about where Las Vegas had pegged him for, they pegged him for about 580 yards. He was right on target in terms of that at 565. Yep. So he could have been a little over potentially if the Ravens had been playing more close games, more games where they had to catch up. So that would have been good. The 54.7% catch rate is not good, and that's been declining since he left New York. It is in part a function of getting some deeper runs, and his yards per reception was the highest of his, I think the highest of his career, but if it wasn't the highest of his career, it was very close at 16 or so. And the thing that he just was way over expectation in is yards per target at 8.8. Right.
And a lot of that is also related to the deep ball usage, especially early and in the mid part of the season. He did catch some really big passes for Lamar, a couple spectacular receptions. So, he showed his value in multiple games. The problem was the lack of consistency and availability. Availability is your best ability, and he's just not always there.
Yeah. So he played 50% of the snaps this year. It's interesting. I saw a tweet from him today that said he played 30% of the snaps, but he played 50% of the snaps this year. Had 64 targets. I think anybody who I was asking the question to before the season of how are you constructing his yards in terms of the three ways you get there, because yards in a season is how many games you're playing times how many targets per game times how many yards per target. So give me those three factors separately, and then I can take your 1,100 yard approximation significantly. And a lot of people, they'll back into it however they think it's reasonable to back into it, and they'll come up with some outrageous number of game plays and if you really thought he was going to play more than he did, you probably were very much let down by this season from Odell Beckham, or you should admit it now. In fact, I thought he played exactly as much as the Ravens could expect, frankly. Even at 50% of snaps, I would think that was probably a slight over for me in terms of where I thought he'd be at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The amount of snaps played, that was pretty good. Yeah, his numbers, yards per target, were so much greater than what you and I were talking about. I did have similar hopes, maybe a little bit lower than that when we did that projection show. But, that's a really solid number. he also had 3 receiving touchdowns, which we didn't get to yet, which was a 12.5% touchdown share from Lamar's 24 passing touchdowns, and then a 4.7% touchdown rate, which is, like I talked about earlier.
He didn't catch. That was Kolar, right? Who caught the touchdown from Huntley. I think it was.
Yeah, Beckham was not a part of that last game. I don't think.
Okay, yeah. And so Beckham did catch a very late touchdown from Lamar, where they were kind of forcing the ball through for his first touchdown as a Raven. And I'm not trying to minimize his contributions here, because I think some other things he did well. I think he was a good locker room guy. I think it's good to have an anti-hero on your team. I think what he did in terms of drawing penalties really added value to the Ravens, in particular, taking a moment to step on Jeffrey Simmons' hands. It's a dirty play, but he got away with it and drew a 15-yard foul out of the thing. It's usually something the Ravens fall for. They end up taking a personal foul on unnecessary roughness for being the instigator. And, just look at Travis Kelce and what he was able to get the Ravens to do. You have to respect Beckham being able to get that done, even though it clearly was dirty. And some of the early pass interferences and defensive holdings he's getting, it's veteran understanding of where the official is relative to you in the play.
Yeah, I mean, he brought such veteran savvy to the receiving room. And I think a lot of the signing value, even though it was short of what he got paid in the cap number, that it's going to, impact the Ravens in the future. It was the presence he had in the locker room and on those receivers and on Lamar. I do think having him and Aguilar in the building showed Lamar, what good veteran receivers that have that kind of experience can do. And I think it seems like a presence like him doesn't have to be that same price tag. But somebody, similar is going to be needed in the receiving room next year and probably going forward.
96.5 passer rating throwing to Beckham this year. So that it didn't really let the Ravens down in that way, although he wasn't exceptional. He wasn't, a guy who was clearly making Lamar better than he is. He was a guy who was making Lamar about who he is. I guess the big question for him is, do you expect him to be a Raven in 2024? I
don't think so. Yeah. Earlier in the season, I thought there was a stronger chance, but the way that the season ended, and the price tag of this past season just makes it seem less likely. We'll get to the next guy that I do think has a better shot of being in Baltimore, Nelson Aguilar.
Nelson, let's go to Nelson Aguilar first then, if you want to do that. Start us off.
Yeah, well, Bateman, of course, we expect to be there, but Aguilar, he did play 17 games. I didn't end up dividing his targets and removing those from the last game. So I'll just give you his total numbers from the season. 45 targets and 35 receptions, which means, yes, of course, he had the highest catch rate of all the receivers on the team, 77.8% catch rate.
Let me stop you for 1 second here, because that is such an incredible departure from Nelson Aguilar's past. Guy's had a lot of trouble with drops in his career and had a 59.3% catch rate for his career coming to this year. So 18.5 percentage points better. It's unheard of increment to a receiver's catch rate later in his career. Normally that catch rate will go down as you get older. And the reason is you become more of a go-to guy. You end up with more contested catches, which naturally have a lower catch rate associated with them. And you don't get this. Aguilar was just the opposite. He was a guy who found space late and was a great extended play guy for Lamar.
Yeah, I agree. The role that he had in this offense as wide receiver 4, suits him really well. I think he's a strong player in that particular position. So to finish out his stats from the season, 381 receiving yards, which wasn't great. That was 10.89 yards per reception, but his yards per target were pretty solid, 8.47 yards per target. And he had 4 receiving touchdowns, which also was really nice considering the low amount of targets he had. That was a 16.7% touchdown share and 8.9% touchdown rate, which is very high. So, yeah, definitely pleased with what we got from Aguilar.
So two things to add to that. And part of this goes to the 8.9% touchdown rate, which is one of the 4 factors that goes into quarterback rating. But the passer rating throwing to him was 122.3. So he was a guy who made Lamar better than who he is by finding space for him, by doing all the things that he does to help a quarterback. 5.4% drop rate, also a massive improvement on his recent play in New England, where he'd really had a lot of problems. I was very down on the Aguilar signing. Never happier to be wrong than about this one. But he was a guy who I thought, there's no way you give up a 6th-round pick for a guy who's been at the bottom of all these very significant metrics, which are, not side nothings to what's going on. They're pretty primary elements. And, just a great year for Aguilar. I thought, as the year went on, I think the touchdown pass to Zay Flowers against the Rams, which put the Ravens ahead, it was late in regulation, maybe about 1:15 or something left. And it was on maybe a 3rd and 10 play, but whatever. Ravens were down to a couple downs where they had to score a touchdown. A field goal wasn't going to do it.
Right.
And they gave up then the tying field goal to the Rams, won it in overtime, of course. But the touchdown to Flowers, he drew that safety off, and reportedly he called it in the huddle for Lamar. He says, I know I can drag that safety off that left hash. You go ahead and wait for Zay to come open behind me, kind of thing.
Yeah, I loved hearing that story. I believe, he's another guy, like I was talking about with Beckham, that is a good presence for the locker room and for those younger receivers. So
yeah, be very excited to see him come back, by the way. And by the way, I know that story is true for a couple of reasons. First of all, multiple people are reporting among players. But second of all, look at Aguilar from the top view, which is the side view. No, the top view. It's called the top view. That's the all 22 from the side that gives you good depth of the receivers and whatnot. If you look at him from the top view, you can see his reaction after the play, where all he did was take a safety out of the play and the ball went to Flowers. He celebrates like it was his touchdown. Yep. He's immediately fist pumps down and runs over to Flowers and pops him on the helmet and whatnot. There's no doubt about that being true. Post-play emotion in film study, by the way, one of the biggest tells you can find in terms of what really happened on the play.
Yeah, I agree with that big time.
How about 2024? Does he come back?
I think so. I have a feeling that Beckham will go somewhere else, and I think they will bring back Aguilar on a reasonable deal.
What's your number on that? What are you willing to spend for a player like Aguilar?
So what did he end up getting paid this year?
3.25.
3.25. I mean, if he would do something similar to that, I would do that again.
Okay. 2 years for $7 million. Or would you not want to get caught up in a 2-year deal when you could have a 1-year deal at, say, 3.25? Would you prefer that?
If you need to have a lower cap hit this year, then you could do 2 years, 7, and then the cap will continue to rise, and you can figure out after that. So maybe a 2-year deal. Okay. 2 for $7 sounds reasonable. Anything less than that's great. 2 for $8 is probably about as high as I would go.
Okay. All right, we'll see how that runs out, because I think he's a guy who it would kind of make sense for the Ravens to sign, I think, at this point. Let's go back to Bateman for a second, because obviously Bateman did some things that were nice this year. I thought he built a lot of trust points despite not really having a great year by a lot of metrics. Built a lot of trust points with Lamar coming back and knocking footballs down and really saving Lamar some interceptions this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. Even though he never felt super healthy early in the season, he was able to play 16 games, which was really nice. His numbers were not so great. He had 56 targets, 32 receptions, which means he had a 57.14% catch rate. 367 receiving yards, for 11.47 yards per reception and 6.55 yards per target. That number right there is
the big one.
Yeah, it's basically death as a receiver. I mean, something below 7 is pretty horrendous, and in the 6s is just bad. And then he had the one receiving touchdown, so that meant his touchdown share was low and his touchdown percentage was pretty terrible as well.
I have a couple of stats to add to this. The yards per target is an enormous drop. He was at 10.2 the previous year, and it was only in 28 targets. But to go from 28 targets to 56 targets and go from 10.2 to 6.6 yards per target, I mean, it almost didn't add yardage. He did add some, but not very much total yardage, aggregate yardage. Only a 61.7 passer rating throwing to him. That's utterly terrible. We talked about Beckham not improving the quarterback. Bateman, I'm not 100% sure it's all on him. There is and I don't think it explains the whole difference, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think Lamar may have a slight lack of trust on Bateman on the deep ball, allowing him to go up and grab it, which caused some overthrows to occur. And so you have overthrows in the field of play. Some of it's on Lamar and whatnot, but when it happens so regularly to the same receiver and it doesn't happen to a player like Beckham nearly as often, you really start to wonder about, what the hell's going on here. Just let him catch the football and let him give you a chance. Well, Bateman's had some drops. He's had some interceptions allowed. I think those were, things to look at. It should be the X receiver position should be wide open for him this year. Flowers would be on the other side of the field, presumably, but I don't expect Beckham back taking away share from him from that X spot. And in fact, there's not another obvious X that the Ravens have currently. So it's Bateman or no one. And that means his route running really will show off on that side of the field more. Now, the unfortunate side effect of that is I think also Lamar has a strong affinity for the strong side of the football field.
And I would agree with that.
Most right-handed quarterbacks do, but also you got multiple receivers over there, and it's easier to check from one read to the next when you're on that same side rather than look back left. Hopefully Bateman is able to take advantage of available space, become an extended play threat, and also become someone that Lamar just trusts to leave that corner behind at the top of the route. Once he starts trusting that and just throws to the spot that he knows Bateman is going to, they're going to become an unbelievable duo. And I think that may even be something that is more forced upon them than anything else this next season.
Right.
So we'll see how that, certainly how that plays out.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, he has all of the physical tools you can want in a receiver, and he's shown so much potential in his career so far that you're just waiting for it to all come together. And I think this year coming up could be really big for him. I mean, it's a contract year.
Yep.
Depending on what the Ravens do with the 5th-year option, that's an interesting thing. I can bring it up real quick.
Of course. Yeah.
You think that the Ravens will, take his 5th-year option, or they'll decline it? Like, what would you put the odds at?
Okay, so there are 2 5th-year options they're looking at. One is OA, which I think they'll certainly pick up. Mm-hmm. And that's $12.4 million, I think, or it's 12 point something million. And the other one is Bateman, which is 13.2, 13.4. I think that price is too high. So I think they'll say no on that. They'll let him play this year. Hopefully, if Bateman starts being the Bateman first-round pick we hoped he would be, you re-sign him at midseason to a long-term deal. You lose out on a little bit of value because you're going to have to pay more than $13 million for the next season if he ends up being the player you hope he is. Right. And then the other side of that coin is if he has a pretty good year, you end up just letting him walk. But he's not a player like. Okay, just let's start with this. It's an unfortunate situation that at the end of the first round, most of the players you take that are not quarterbacks, and most of the players you take at the end of the first round are not quarterbacks, don't have a lot of 5th-year option value. There's too steep a drop off in potential play. You have to play at the top of the market effectively, and so it ends up being not value. It's very to have one of 2 hit on their 5th-year option, basically from 2 picks that are 5 apart or 4 apart. Is very nice.
It was 27 and 31.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the Ravens are always lucky to get 1 out of 2, and in some ways, you're lucky not to have 2 out of 2 that you really have to pay, because those stacked contracts, you'd already be looking to unwind that and probably trade one of these guys.
Right.
And they had to do that with a lot of the 2018 draft that all matured at the same time and had to be paid. And ended up trading Orlando Brown and Hayden Hurst and let Zach Sealer go and whatnot. It's just unfortunate, series of unwindings that occurred with that.
Yeah, completely agree. I also would say Bateman does not get the 5th-year option. I do think Owe will have his picked up, and we'll see what happens. If Bateman does show who he can be this year, then I think he's going to get paid, whether that's in Baltimore or not. But based on what he's done, I think the price tag is a little too rich.
Let's jump on to Devin Duvernay here. Disappointing injuries, a lack of playing time. I thought he could have been a good gadget player for the Ravens, especially when I thought too much of that play was going to Flowers early. They weren't taking advantage of who he was. But Duvernay really just not used in the offense this year. 2.0 yards per target and a 51.6 passer rating throwing to him is, I think, enough said in terms of the receiving stats. He came off an 8.3 yards per target year, where he'd been a big part of the offense and had pretty good hands and whatnot. I was actually a little surprised when I look at it to see how many games he'd actually played in this year, because we just have not seen him on offense. But still a very fine contributor as a punt returner. 12.6 yards per return in 23, 12.8 in his career. To give you an idea on that, the 12.8 punt return average for Devin Duvernay is the 6th highest all time of players with 60-plus returns. And if you look back at that list, and I've got it up here, the top players are all from the 40s and 50s, pretty much. So it's all guys you haven't heard of. Ernie Steele of Philadelphia, 14.7. Jim Cason, 14.1, who played LDH, whatever position that is, for the Rams in San Francisco in the 40s and 50s. Charlie Trippy, not Trippakicky, or the Twitter handle we all know, played for the Cardinals. Dick Christie, who played from 58 into the AFL years, is one of the first names that I recognize. There is one Raven who returned 2 punts for the Ravens. Jeff Ogden is number 6, who snuck on there. Actually, he's only got 67 returns, so he doesn't, or 57 rather. So he didn't quite make the list of 60, but he's close anyway, and was on that list. So it's a bunch of guys from a long time ago. This century, the guys who've retired, the only one is Ogden, who finished in 2002 with the Ravens at 13.1, but he doesn't have 60. And after that, you have to go down to, I think, Devin Hester is the next one.
I would imagine Hester would be pretty high. Yeah.
Gunnar Olszewski, there's the other one. He's for New England, the guy who he had 98 punt returns. So, we shouldn't forget what Devin did for this organization. But I think what I'm getting to is I don't think there's a very good chance he's back next year.
I completely agree. The writing was on the wall with his usage this season. He has been a good returner. I think he'll continue to have some play in the league. Somebody's going to pick him up and use him as a punt returner and maybe a gadget player. But, Chris Moore had a great special teams career with the Ravens, and he's still kicking it in the NFL. So, we'll see.
And they were using Duvernay to cover kicks. I don't know if he was a 4-unit guy, but I think he might have actually been used as a gunner some this year as well, which is really unusual to be used as a gunner and a return man.
Right. But, more injury risk for sure. Yeah. But
a couple other guys who got a little bit of playing time. Laquan Treadwell had a catch in the Steelers game. He might have had one other catch, but I think a 16-yard catch against the Steelers is the one I really remember. And then Tylan Wallace, of course, had one catch during the regular season, but obviously known for winning the Rams game with that wonderful punt return.
Yeah. And Tylan Wallace is still under contract, so I expect him to be back and probably make the team as the returner, depending on how many receivers they add.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that, but he would be naturally next up in that regard. You wouldn't give it to somebody else, I don't think. And he'll probably return punts, but not kickoffs, you would think?
Yeah, I agree. Justice Hill, honestly, he's probably too valuable now to really put him in a returning role. But you've seen some clear kick return ability from Justice Hill. So I imagine they have another running back that could do something similar this upcoming season. I don't expect that to be Keaton Mitchell. I really don't expect him to be back fully until, October, November. My rule of thumb is a year out from the injury, and a lot of people are like, "Oh yeah, he'll be back for the start of the season," and I just can't expect that, and I don't want to think that way either. So,
right.
I imagine there will be some players they bring in to kind of compete for that position of kick returner.
Right. I would agree with that. I think it's kind of hard right at this exact juncture of events to look forward to 2024, but I would expect them to take a pick in the draft at wide receiver.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to get off the vet treadmill still. They're doing too much of that in terms of re-signing players. I think Aguilar would be a good bargain, but I don't want them to go out and get a $9 or $10 million receiver.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Aguilar is the guy to re-sign, and then I think you draft at least one, maybe two guys. It just depends on how EDC moves around the board and acquires picks. So, but I definitely say they add one receiver in the draft and maybe more.
Okay. All right. Oh, always a pleasure to talk football with you, Jake. This is, a tough day to go through this, but we're having to do this. This will post in a few days, and it may seem like old news, unfortunately, at that time. But tell folks where they can talk football with you or read your material online.
Yeah, I am on Twitter or X at Real Jake Vogel. I am pretty active on there, tweeting about the Ravens and the Georgia Bulldogs. Big into the NFL draft, so I'm going to try to carve out some time to look through different position groups this off season, and I primarily focus on what the Ravens would be adding. So look forward to talking to people in regards to that as well.
And we'll look forward to having you on this show for at least a position group, and we'll see other opportunities as they present themselves during this offseason. One of the things I want all of you people who are listening to think about is if there's one player in Ravens history you'd like to talk about this offseason who is not one of the greatest Ravens ever. So I'm not talking about the greatest 20 Ravens of all time, but a second-tier player that you really appreciated what he did for the team. So who was that guy? If you're an Orioles fan, maybe it was you were really a fan of Terry Crowley, or you were a fan of some Jesse Orosco, or some guy who wasn't at the top of the rotation and wasn't the cleanup hitter or whatever. But we're looking for some player like that. I know I've got a bunch of favorites. Tyus Bowser, I think, would be a guy I'd like to talk about, or Chad Williams. But I'll be reaching out to people, and I want you to reach out to me. DMs are always open on Twitter. Tell me who that player is you want to talk about, and that'll be our historical series for this off season that will be recording and playing shows pretty much right up till training camp. But hit me up early is always better, and I definitely want to hear it from you. Jake, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Ken.
And we'll talk to you next time on Film Study.